Hello everybody, Glass Half Dead here with 6 commonly misunderstood rules I see regular players misplaying or not fully understanding in Warhammer 40,000 Kill Team. If you want to check your basic knowledge, I did a 19 beginner rules mistakes where I told you the answers to 19 common rules mistakes. But in this video I am sticking to only 6 commonly misplayed rules, but I'll be going into more depth so that hopefully you can gain a bit of knowledge and figure out any future rules, interactions and mishaps based on this video. If you need line of sight help, check out the most comprehensive line of sight video in existence that coincidentally is made by me. Honestly, line of sight is something we all need to know. Each rule in this list hinges on a different interaction. Jump to the relevant timestamp if you need a specific question answered ASAP, or hang around and just absorb the rule lore knowledge that I shall be spilling before you. Each explanation will end with a real in-game example of the principle where relevant. But first, of course, if you are a subscriber to my channel, I'd like to give you a big double hello. Such a wholesome pleasantry. If you want a wholesome pleasantry for yourself, then like, subscribe, leave a comment, and that can be yours in the very next video. If you like Kill Team, then jump into my Discord that has all the Kill Team chat you could ever want. And if you especially like my coverage of Kill Team, consider supporting me on Patreon, as you know, certain things I do are only possible thanks to those absolute legends. I also have a new channel, which is just me doing whatever I do here, but in a more slightly game agnostic way, mainly focusing on Age of Sigmar right now, and that is Age of Glass. All links in description. 6 advanced rules, let's go. It's climbing, dropping, movement cost. I want to start with the most useful and least complicated one, and that has to be climbing, and how it's really just about movement cost, not working out heights. Everyone goes through a phase of wondering how climbing works, and then also how dropping works. And lads, ladesses, lad-I, I've got you covered. You're overthinking it. Take a step back, break it down. We all know and accept how traversing works, yes? If you move over a traversable piece of terrain, you move 1 circle less than normal. You don't count going up or down that traversable piece because you paid the movement cost, right? Movement cost. You know that you don't skip any horizontal movement. So with a standard movement of 3 circle, going over a traversable piece of terrain means that you can end up 2 circle away from where you began. Movement cost. Taxation without representation, so to speak, which explains why the Americans hate traversing. Climbing and dropping exactly the same as movement when traversing. I'll give you a moment to collect the fragments of your exploded brain if that is something that's just happened to you when I've started to describe movement cost. All of the verbiage and clauses around how to climb and drop are to make sure you're not doing crazy things, right? Needing to be within triangle of the wall is to stop you from just floating around the kill zone. And the rounding up and down to the nearest circle is a representation of how easy or difficult and how fast or slow it is to make the climb or drop. But ultimately, you work out the height of what you're climbing. That is the movement cost. Then, just as if you were traversing, you pick your model up and move the horizontal distance minus the movement cost, which in this instance, instead of being a single circle, like in traverse, is dependent on how high the thing you're climbing is. Typically, 2 circle. To summarize, you never skip horizontal movement. Think of all climbing and dropping as a traverse, but with a variable movement cost. Performing an action once. Sorry for the awkward title of this one, but I like to start as I mean to go on, and this one is going to go on a tangent that will seem unrelated until I rein it all back in. Everyone knows that you can only perform an action once. Unless you have a ploy like Bolted Discipline, which specifically says that you can perform 2 shoot or fight actions, that's activation. And that wording right there is the crux. You can only perform an action once per activation. If you are outside of your operative's activation, they don't have any limits on the actions they can perform. Worthy of note, in a very similar vein, there is a difference between performing an action and doing the action. You have a limit on performing the action within activation, but if something simply does the action, then it bypasses the need to perform it. Again, we're talking super edge case scenarios here, but keep in mind, if you're ever getting deep into the rules lawyering, that's how that's worded. So, within your activation, you can perform a shoot action once, but it's entirely possible that you may have access to a rule that tells you to simply make a shoot action. That doesn't exist in the game yet, and normally these clauses are worded differently, but that would work just as an example. Now, for an example of this, let's look at the novitiate ability Defenders of the Faith. At the start of the firefight phase, one novitiate next to each objective can perform a free shoot and or fight action. If you have initiative, you could potentially fight a model you're in melee with, get the kill, and then shoot at another model, then immediately activate that model, and even though you have just fought and shot with that model, those actions were out of your activation, so the restriction of one action per activation has not been triggered. So you could fight and shoot again, which would then trigger your perform activation limit. To recap, you can only perform an action once in your activation, but you can make an action without that restriction, and there are no restrictions on performing actions outside of your activation. That does make sense, I promise. Free actions. While we're talking about actions, let's define free actions. Now, this isn't the beginner rules video, so you already know that a free action refers to the cost of the action, not that it could be performed multiple times. Luckily, I just discussed that above, and it being a free action doesn't change that. So why do we see so many free actions? And if there isn't an action restriction outside of activations, why do they give us a free action? A free action means it doesn't cost you any APL to use that action. When in activations, this is normally given when you are combining two actions, for example in Dash. Dash costs you 1 APL and then gives you a free shoot and free dash action. After performing Dash, you cannot shoot or dash again. That's just the terminology they use to combine actions. Now, why do they give us free actions outside of an activation? You're outside of an activation, so who cares how much APL it costs? Well, that's because even when you're outside of your activation, you are still bound by APL limits. And you only actually have APL when you activate. You generate APL upon activating your model. So, to make any of these actions outside of your activation, it needs to be a free action. You might be struggling to see why I've gone so deep on free actions, something you already know. I did begin by telling you that I want to give you a bit of knowledge to help in the future, so can you think of any instance where this knowledge will clear things up? Rules that have been right there from the start helping us fix a new rules interaction maybe? That's right, you guessed correctly, it's the Wormblade's Locus and his unique action, Quicksilver Strike. This ability discusses interrupting your opponent's activation, and a lot of people wondered if it's an always-on ability and it effectively acts as your Locus, simply always having -1 APL if the ability triggers. But as us men of culture now know, you don't have any APL for this ability to trigger randomly, and so its implementation is clear. You must turn the ability on during the Locus's regular activation, and only then it is active for the rest of the turning point. In summary, you generate APL at the beginning of your operative's activation, and so anything that requires APL outside of your activation must be a free action. 3D space, base to base. Cover lines are critical to line of sight, but in the rulebook they are only ever shown as a diagram from a top-down perspective, and this has led some people to believe that the game is played as if it were a 2D game, ignoring the differences that height can bring. Keep in mind that diagrams are there as a visual aid to help us understand the words. The words are the rules, the diagrams are the help. The diagrams are not the definition. Obviously, here we're talking about how to work out cover lines in relation to vantage points. If you've never encountered this problem, then just know that we are playing Kill Team in a 3D space and move on. This is obvious to some, that's why we have cool terrain to climb, but it still gets asked a lot. This question is asked both for measuring range and for movement, so let's cover range first, as that's quite easy. When measuring between two models, you always draw the line base to base, and sticking out parts of your model have nothing to do with measuring range. Check out my line of sight video if you've forgotten, but after visibility is checked, the model is irrelevant and it's all about the bases. So there's really no ambiguity here. And frankly, that's also the extent of the ruling when it comes to working out cover lines too. When cover lines are drawn, they are drawn one base to another. Zero ambiguity. I will now give you an example of why people question this. Understand that these are edge cases that work very oddly, but this is the raw. That's rules as written. Here we have Dackerboy on a vantage point, that cheeky little mushroom sausage. He wants to shoot at your local friendly Kriegsman who's just minding his own business, honestly. He's got visibility. Lovely. When we draw in the cover line, however, as we are measuring in 3D space, his cover line intersects with the wall at the end of the vantage point, which is heavy terrain. If this was measured in 2D, this wouldn't happen. To cure this, the cheeky Dackerboy needs to have his cover line be within 1 inch of his base when it passes through the heavy terrain, or shoot from a side that doesn't have a wall below you. Now, Dackerboy is being shot at due to people's prejudice against the hobby of hat collecting, an all too common occurrence in the grimdark future of the 41st millennium. But he's got a friend to stand in front of him, so he can't be shot. Or does he? Let's look again. As we draw the cover line in 3D space, despite his friend being in front of him, the cover line doesn't intersect with the friend's base, so Dackerboy still gets shot. Blimey, that friend is a real knob, isn't he? This is obviously very unintuitive, and feel free to house rule it so that you're playing Kill Team a bit more like it's a 2.5D world instead of full 3D. But again, that's the raw, and it works the majority of the time. Indirect and cover. Indirect lets you hit someone behind cover when they're on a conceal order. We often say it ignores cover because ignoring cover is the only way you can do that, but they still get to retain a dice from being in cover. So you're not ignoring cover, really. How do the special rules indirect and being in cover interact? This is a great rule to dig into, as understanding it clears up a lot of other rules interactions that get questioned as to understand why it works the way it works. You have to take it back to basics, and most rules make sense when you do that. Firstly, break down the rule. Indirect. Each time a friendly operative makes a shooting attack with this weapon, in the select valid target step of that shooting attack, enemy operatives are not in cover. Okay, we see not in cover and we assume that's something that means you don't get cover. Makes sense. But there's a condition before that. In the select valid target step. Okay, so indirect makes the target not have cover in that one specific step of the shooting attack. Well, in the select valid target step, all you're doing is seeing who is a legal target for the attack. Hence why weapons with indirect can target operatives on a conceal order behind cover. But you don't decide what the operative you're attacking rolls for the defense dice until step 4 of the shooting sequence, roll defense dice. And indirect only ignores cover in step 2. Therefore, models still get a cover save from weapons with indirect because the select valid target step does not affect the rest of the attack. Don't be afraid to take complicated rules back to basics and break things down step by step. That's exactly why the rules are bullet pointed out so elaborately for us. Finally, we look at special rules. This is almost an addendum to the previous rule dive, and I'm struggling to not just call this "they mean what they say." Kill Team is something called a permissive rule set. This means that when they write rules, they say what you can do. They say you can make a shoot action. They don't say you can't make a fight, move, charge, or mission action. This means that if the rules do not state you can do something, then you can't. And this goes beyond what you are allowed to attempt to do and extends to the wordings in rules themselves. For example, the special rule Mortal Wounds. There is a ploy for the Hunter cadre called Stand and Fire that allows you to use your gun in melee. A lot of people have misconceptions about how this works, and I think it's a really good example because it's not immediately obvious. If you use this tactic on an operative with a rail rifle, you have special rules that go along with the weapon profile. AP1, Lethal 5+, and Mortal Wound 2. Now we all know that AP1 has no effect because AP only affects defense dice and you don't roll defense dice in melee. That's an easy one. Lethal 5-up, just from a glance, feels like it would work because we know that other melee weapons have Lethal 5-up, so that's not weird. But Mortal Wound 2. No melee weapon has Mortal Wound 2, but maybe this is a sneaky hack just for the ploy, right? But of course, the point of everything I'm saying here is that this is a permissive rule set. Let's read Mortal Wounds. Each time a friendly operative makes a shooting attack with this weapon, in the roll attack dice step of that shooting attack, for each critical hit retained, inflict X mortal wounds on the target. X is the number after the weapon's mortal wound, e.g. Mortal Wound 3. I think you've seen the issue, right? It says, when you make a shooting attack. But that's not what you're doing. You're fighting in melee using the profile of your ranged weapon. You are not making a shooting attack. If the rule doesn't specifically state it happens, then it does not happen. Okay everybody, I hope you found this a useful video, and if you made it all the way to the end, please consider sharing this with any others that are trying to learn the rules. I have more videos like this coming up, and I also have a new channel that is basically just what I do here, but for, you know, Age of Sigmar, other games, third-party games, all that good stuff. And of course, if you made it to the end of the video, here's your Pavlovian reward, the vaunted triple hello. Outrageously wholesome. Check out my Patreon. This is a big last update. I hope you've had a good day. Continue to have a good day. Goodbye.